你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第62節。咁上一回就好簡短咁樣介紹咗 Don Quixote 入城入咗巴塞隆納，受到之前嘅賊頭 Roque Guinart 嘅朋友們嘅盛情招待。注意 Roque Guinart 自己係唔喺城入面嘅，因為咧佢係受到個城主嘅通緝，佢係唔敢入城嘅。咁呢係佢嘅朋友就應承咗Guinart會盛情招待啦，而佢哋咧就淨係向住佢朋友屋企度進發。呢一節62節個名叫做 Which deals with the adventure of the enchanted head together with other trivial matters which cannot be left untold。咁啊，似乎有啲趣事會發生喎，咁我哋睇下發生咩事啊
Don Quixote's host was one Don Antonio Moreno by name, a gentleman of wealth and intelligence, and very fond of diverting himself in any fair and good-natured way. And having Don Quixote in his house, he set about devising modes of making him exhibit his mad points in some harmless fashion. For jests that give pain are no jests, and no sport is worth anything if it hurts another. The first thing he did was to make Don Quixote take off his armor, and lead him in that tight chamois suit we have already described and depicted more than once, out on the balcony overhanging one of the chief streets of the city, in full view of the crowd and of the boys, who gazed at him as they would at a monkey. The cavaliers in livery careered before him again, as though it were for him alone, and not to enliven the festival of the day, that they wore it, and Sancho was in high delight, for it seemed to him that, how he knew not, he had fallen upon another Camacho's wedding, another house like Don Diego de Miranda's, another castle like the Duke's. Some of Don Antonio's friends dined with him that day, and all showed honor to Don Quixote and treated him as a knight-errant, and he, becoming puffed up and exalted in consequence, could not contain himself for satisfaction. Such were the drolleries of Sancho that all the servants of the house, and all who heard him, were kept hanging upon his lips. While at table, Don Antonio said to him, We hear, worthy Sancho, that you are so fond of manjar blanco and force meat balls, that if you have any left, you keep them in your bosom for the next day. No, senor, that's not true, said Sancho, for I am more cleanly than greedy, and my master Don Quixote here knows well that we too are used to live for a week on a handful of acorn and nuts. To be sure, if it so happens that they offer me a heifer, I run with a halter. I mean, I eat what I'm given, and make use of opportunities as I find them. But whoever says that I'm an out-of-the-way eater or not cleanly, let me tell him that he is wrong, and I'd put it in a different way if I did not respect the honorable beards that are at the table. Indeed, said Don Quixote, Sancho's moderation and cleanliness in eating might be inscribed and engraved on plates of brass, to be kept in eternal remembrance in ages to come. It is true that when he is hungry, there is a certain appearance of ferocity about him, for he eats at a great pace and chews with both jaws, but cleanliness he is always mindful of, and when he was governor he learned how to eat daintily, so much so that he eats grapes, and even pomegranate pips, with a fork. What? Said Don Antonio. Has Sancho been a governor? Aye, said Sancho, and of an island called Barataria. I governed it to perfection for 10 days, and lost my rest all the time, and learned to look down upon all the governments in the world. I got out of it by taking to flight, and fell into a pit where I gave myself up for dead, and out of which I escaped alive by a miracle. Don Quixote then gave them a minute account of the whole affair of Sancho's government, with which he greatly amused his hearers. On the cloth being removed, Don Antonio, taking Don Quixote by the hand, passed with him into a distant room in which there was nothing in the way of furniture except the table, apparently of jasper, resting on a pedestal of the same, upon which was set up, after the fashion of the busts of the Roman emperors, a head which seemed to be of bronze. Don Antonio traversed the whole apartment with Don Quixote and walked round the table several times, and then said, Now, Señor Don Quixote, that I am satisfied that no one is listening to us, and that the door is shut, I will tell you of one of the rarest adventures, or more properly speaking strange things, that can be imagined, on condition that you will keep what I say to you in the remotest recesses of secrecy. I swear it, said Don Quixote, and for greater security I will put a flagstone over it. For I would have you know, Señor Don Antonio, that you are addressing one who, though he has ears to hear, has no tongue to speak, so that you may safely transfer whatever you have in your bosom into mine, and rely upon it that you have consigned it to the depths of silence. In reliance upon that promise, said Don Antonio, I will astonish you with what you shall see and hear, and relieve myself of some of the vexation it gives me to have no one to whom I can confide my secrets, for they are not of a sort to be entrusted to everybody. Don Quixote was puzzled, wondering what could be the object of such precautions, whereupon Don Antonio, taking his hand, passed it over the bronze head and the whole table and the pedestal of jasper on which it stood, and then said, This head, Señor Don Quixote, has been made and fabricated by one of the greatest magicians and wizards the world ever saw, a Pole, I believe, by birth, and a pupil of the famous Escotillo, of whom such marvellous stories are told. He was here in my house, and for a consideration of 1,000 crowns that I gave him, he constructed this head, which has the property and virtue of answering whatever questions are put to its ear. He observed the points of the compass, he traced figures, he studied the stars, he watched favourable moments, and at length brought it to the perfection we shall see tomorrow. For on Fridays it is mute, and this being Friday, we must wait till the next day. In the interval your worship may consider what you would like to ask it, and I know by experience that in all its answers it tells the truth. Don Quixote was amazed at the virtue and property of the head, and was inclined to disbelieve Don Antonio. But seeing what a short time he had to wait to test the matter, he did not choose to say anything except that he thanked him for having revealed to him so mighty a secret. They then quitted the room. Don Antonio locked the door, and they repaired to the chamber where the rest of the gentlemen were assembled. In the meantime, Sancho had recounted to them several of the adventures and accidents that had happened his master. That afternoon they took Don Quixote out for a stroll, not in his armour but in street costume, with a surcoat of tawny cloth upon him, that at that season would have made ice itself sweat. Orders were left with the servants to entertain Sancho so as not to let him leave the house. Don Quixote was mounted, not on Rocinante, but upon a tall mule of easy pace and handsomely caparisoned. They put the surcoat on him, and on the back, without his perceiving it, they stitched a parchment on which they wrote in large letters, This is Don Quixote of La Mancha. As they set out upon the excursion, the placard attracted the eyes of all who chanced to see him. And as they read out, This is Don Quixote of La Mancha, Don Quixote was amazed to see how many people gazed at him, called him by his name, and recognized him, and turning to Don Antonio, who rode at his side, he observed to him, Great are the privileges knight-errantry involves, for it makes him who professes it known and famous in every region of the earth. See, Don Antonio, even the very boys of this city know me without ever having seen me. True, Señor Don Quixote, returned Don Antonio, for as fire cannot be hidden or kept secret, virtue cannot escape being recognized, and that which is attained by the profession of arms shines distinguished above all others. It came to pass, however, that as Don Quixote was proceeding amid the acclamations that have been described, a Castilian, reading the inscription on his back, cried out in a loud voice, The devil take thee for Don Quixote of La Mancha! What, art thou here, and not dead of the countless drubbings that have fallen on thy ribs? Thou art mad, and if thou wert so by thyself, and kept thyself within thy madness, it would not be so bad. But thou hast the gift of making fools and blockheads of all who have anything to do with thee or say to thee. Why, look at these gentlemen bearing thee company. You get thee home, blockhead, and see after thy affairs, and thy wife and children, and give over these fooleries that are sapping thy brains and skimming away thy wits. Go your own way, brother, said Don Antonio, and don't offer advice to those who don't ask you for it. Señor Don Quixote is in his full senses, and we who bear him company are not fools. Virtue is to be honoured wherever it may be found. Go, and bad luck to you, and don't meddle where you are not wanted. By God, your worship is right, replied the Castilian. For to advise this good man is to kick against the pricks. Still, for all that, it fills me with pity that the sound wit they say the blockhead has in everything should dribble away by the channel of his knight-errantry. But may the bad luck your worship talks of follow me and all my descendants, if, from this day forth, though I should live longer than Methuselah, I ever give advice to anybody, even if he asks me for it. The advice giver took himself off, and they continued their stroll. But so great was the press of the boys and people to read the placard that Don Antonio was forced to remove it as if he were taking off something else. Night came and they went home, and there was a ladies' dancing party. For Don Antonio's wife, a lady of rank and gaiety, beauty and wit, had invited some friends of hers to come and do honor to her guest and amuse themselves with strange delusions. Several of them came. They supped sumptuously. The dance began at about 10 o'clock. Among the ladies were two of mischievous and frolicsome turn, and, though perfectly modest, somewhat free in playing tricks for harmless diversion's sake. These two were so indefatigable in taking Don Quixote out to dance that they tired him down, not only in body but in spirit. It was a sight to see the figure Don Quixote made, long, lank, lean, and yellow, his garments clinging tight to him, ungainly, and above all anything but agile. The gay ladies made secret love to him, and he on his part secretly repelled them. But finding himself hard pressed by their blandishments, he lifted up his voice and exclaimed, "Behold the cross of the Lord! Leave me in peace, unwelcome overtures. Avaunt with your desires, ladies, for she who is queen of mine, the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso, suffers none but hers to lead me captive and subdue me." And so saying, he sat down on the floor in the middle of the room, tired out and broken down by all this exertion in the dance. Don Antonio directed him to be taken up bodily and carried to bed, and the first that laid hold of him was Sancho, saying as he did so, "In an evil hour you took to dancing. Master mine, do you fancy all mighty men of valor are dancers, and all knights errant given to capering? If you do, I can tell you you are mistaken. There's many a man would rather undertake to kill a giant than cut a caper. If it had been the shoe fling you were at, I could take your place, for I can do the shoe fling like a Javalcan, but I'm no good at dancing." With these and other observations, Sancho set the whole ballroom laughing, and then put his master to bed, covering him up so well that he might sweat out any chill caught after his dancing. The next day Don Antonio thought he might as well make trial of the enchanted head, and with Don Quixote, Sancho, and two others, friends of his, besides the two ladies that had tired out Don Quixote at the ball, who had remained for the night with Don Antonio's wife, he locked himself up in the chamber where the head was. He explained to them the property it possessed and entrusted the secret to them, telling them that now for the first time he was going to try the virtue of the enchanted head, but except Don Antonio's two friends, no one else was privy to the mystery of the enchantment. And if Don Antonio had not first revealed it to them, they would have been inevitably reduced to the same state of amazement as the rest, so artfully and skillfully was it contrived. The first to approach the ear of the head was Don Antonio himself, and in a low voice, but not so low as not to be audible to all, he said to it, "Head, tell me by the virtue that lies in thee, what am I at this moment thinking of?" The head, without any movement of the lips, answered in a clear and distinct voice, so as to be heard by all, "I cannot judge of thoughts." All were thunderstruck at this, and all the more so as they saw that there was nobody anywhere near the table or in the whole room that could have answered. "How many of us are here?" asked Don Antonio once more, and it was answered him in the same way softly, "Thou and thy wife, with two friends of thine and two of hers, and a famous knight called Don Quixote of La Mancha, and a squire of his, Sancho Panza by name." Now there was fresh astonishment. Now everyone's hair was standing on end with awe, and Don Antonio, retiring from the head, exclaimed, "This suffices to show me that I have not been deceived by him who sold thee to me, O sage head, talking head, answering head, wonderful head. Let someone else go and put what question he likes to it." And as women are commonly impulsive and inquisitive, the first to come forward was one of the two friends of Don Antonio's wife, and her question was, "Tell me, head, what shall I do to be very beautiful?" And the answer she got was, "Be very modest." "I question thee no further," said the fair querist. Her companion then came up and said, "I should like to know, head, whether my husband loves me or not." The answer given to her was, "Think how he uses thee, and thou mayest guess." And the married lady went off saying, "The answer did not need a question, for of course the treatment one receives shows the disposition of him from whom it is received." Then one of Don Antonio's two friends advanced and asked him, "Who am I?" "Thou knowest," was the answer. "That is not what I asked thee," said the gentleman, "but to tell me if thou knowest me." "Yes, I know thee. Thou art Don Pedro Norris," was the reply. "I do not seek to know more," said the gentleman, "for this is enough to convince me, O head, that thou knowest everything." And as he retired, the other friend came forward and asked him, "Tell me, head, what are the wishes of my eldest son?" "I have said already," was the answer, "that I cannot judge of wishes. However, I can tell thee the wish of thy son is to bury thee." "That's what I see with my eyes, I point out with my finger," said the gentleman, "so I ask no more." Don Antonio's wife came up and said, "I know not what to ask thee, head. I would only seek to know of thee if I shall have many years of enjoyment of my good husband." And the answer she received was, "Thou shalt, for his figure and his temperate habits promise many years of life, which by their intemperance others so often cut short." Then Don Quixote came forward and said, "Tell me, thou that answerest, was that which I described as having happened to me in the cave of Montesinos the truth or a dream? Will Sancho's whipping be accomplished without fail? Will the disenchantment of Dulcinea be brought about?" "As to the question of the cave," was the reply, "there is much to be said. There is something of both in it. Sancho's whipping will proceed leisurely. The disenchantment of Dulcinea will attain its due consummation." "I seek to know no more," said Don Quixote. "Let me but see Dulcinea disenchanted, and I will consider that all the good fortune I could wish for has come upon me all at once." The last questioner was Sancho, and his questions were, "Head, should I by any chance have another government? Should I ever escape from the hard life of a squire? Should I get back to see my wife and children?" To which the answer came, "Thou shalt govern in thy house, and if thou returnest to it, thou shalt see thy wife and children, and on ceasing to serve, thou shalt cease to be a squire." "Good by God," said Sancho Panza. "I could have told myself that. The prophet Peregulo could have said no more." "What answer wouldst thou have, beast?" said Don Quixote. "Is it not enough that the replies this head has given suit the questions put to it?" "Yes, it is enough," said Sancho, "but I should have liked it to have made itself plainer and told me more." The questions and answers came to an end here, but not the wonder with which all were filled, except Don Antonio's two friends who were in secret. This Cide Hamete Benengeli thought fit to reveal at once, not to keep the world in suspense, fancying that the head had some strange magical mystery in it. He says, therefore, that on the model of another head, the work of an image maker, which he had seen at Madrid, Don Antonio made this one at home for his own amusement and to astonish ignorant people, and its mechanism was as follows. The table was of wood painted and varnished to imitate jasper, and the pedestal on which it stood was of the same material, with 4 eagle's claws projecting from it to support the weight more steadily. The head, which resembled a bust figure of the Roman emperor and was colored like bronze, was hollow throughout, as was the table, into which it was fitted so exactly that no trace of the joining was visible. The pedestal of the table was also hollow and communicated with the throat and neck of the head, and the whole was in communication with another room underneath the chamber in which the head stood. Through the entire cavity in the pedestal, table, throat, and neck of the bust or figure, there passed a tube of tin carefully adjusted and concealed from sight. In the room below, corresponding to the one above, was placed the person who was to answer, with his mouth to the tube, and the voice, as in an ear trumpet, passed from above downwards and from below upwards, the words coming clearly and distinctly. It was impossible thus to detect the trick. A nephew of Don Antonio's, a smart, sharp-witted student, was the answerer, and as he had been told beforehand by his uncle who the persons were that would come with him that day into the chamber where the head was, it was an easy matter for him to answer the first question at once and correctly. The others he answered by guesswork, and, being clever, cleverly. Cide Hamete adds that this marvelous contrivance stood for some 10 or 12 days, but that, as it became noised abroad through the city that he had in his house an enchanted head that answered all who asked questions of it, Don Antonio, fearing it might come to the ears of the watchful senators of our faith, explained the matter to the inquisitors, who commanded him to break it up and have done with it, lest the ignorant vulgar should be scandalized. By Don Quixote, however, and by Sancho, the head was still held to be an enchanted one, and capable of answering questions, though more to Don Quixote's satisfaction than Sancho's. the gentlemen of the city, to gratify Don Antonio and also to do the honors to Don Quixote, and give him an opportunity of displaying his folly, made arrangements for a tilting at the ring in 6 days from that time, which, however, for reason that will be mentioned hereafter, did not take place. Don Quixote took a fancy to stroll about the city quietly and on foot, for he feared that if he went on horseback the boys would follow him. So he and Sancho and 2 servants that Don Antonio gave him set out for a walk. Thus it came to pass that going along one of the streets, Don Quixote lifted up his eyes and saw written in very large letters over a door, "Books printed here," at which he was vastly pleased, for until then he had never seen a printing office, and he was curious to know what it was like. He entered with all his following, and saw them drawing sheets in one place, correcting in another, setting up type here, revising there. In short, all the work that is to be seen in great printing offices. He went up to one case and asked what they were about there. The workmen told him. He watched them with wonder, and passed on. He approached one man, among others, and asked him what he was doing. The workman replied, "Signor, this gentleman here has translated an Italian book into our Spanish tongue, and I am setting it up in type for the press." "What is the title of the book?" asked Don Quixote, to which the author replied, "Signor, in Italian the book is called Le Bagatelle." "And what does Le Bagatelle import in our Spanish?" asked Don Quixote. "Le Bagatelle," said the author, "is as though we should say in Spanish Los Juguetes. But though the book is humble in name, it has good solid matter in it." "I," said Don Quixote, "have some little smattering of Italian, and I plume myself on singing some of Ariosto's stanzas. But tell me, signor, I do not say this to test your ability, but merely out of curiosity. Have you ever met with the word piñata in your book?" "Yes, often," said the author. "And how do you render that in Spanish?" "How should I render it?" returned the author, "but by Allah." "Body o' me," exclaimed Don Quixote, "what a proficient you are in the Italian language! I would lay a good wager that where they say in Italian pièce you say in Spanish place, and where they say più you say mas, and you translate su by arriba and giù by abajo." "I translate them so, of course," said the author, "for those are their proper equivalents." "I would venture to swear," said Don Quixote, "that your worship is not known in the world, which always begrudges their reward to rare wits and praiseworthy labours. What talents lie wasted there! What genius thrust away into corners! What worth left neglected! Still it seems to me that translation from one language into another, if it be not from the queens of languages, the Greek and the Latin, is like looking at Flemish tapestries on the wrong side. For though the figures are visible, they are full of threads that make them indistinct, and they do not show with the smoothness and brightness of the right side. And translation from easy languages argues neither ingenuity nor command of words, any more than transcribing or copying out one document from another. But I do not mean by this to draw the inference that no credit is to be allowed for the work of translating. For a man may employ himself in ways worse and less profitable to himself. This estimate does not include 2 famous translators, Dr. Cristobal de Figueroa in his Pasta Fido, and Don Juan de Jauregui and his Aminta, wherein by their felicity they leave it in doubt which is the translation and which the original. But tell me, are you printing this book at your own risk, or have you sold the copyright to some bookseller? "I print at my own risk," said the author, "and I expect to make 1,000 ducats at least by this first edition, which is to be of 2,000 copies that will go off in a twinkling at 6 reals apiece." "A fine calculation you are making," said Don Quixote. "It is plain you don't know the ins and outs of the printers, and how they play into one another's hands. I promise you, when you find yourself saddled with 2,000 copies, you will feel so sore that it will astonish you, particularly if the book is a little out of the common and not in any way highly spiced." "What," said the author, "would your worship, then, have me give it to a bookseller who will give 3 maravedis for the copyright and think he is doing me a favour? I do not print my books to win fame in the world, for I am known in it already by my works. I want to make money, without which reputation is not worth a rap." "God send your worship good luck," said Don Quixote, and he moved on to another case, where he saw them correcting a sheet of a book with the title of Light of the Soul. Noticing it, he observed, "Books like this, though there are many of the kind, are the ones that deserve to be printed. For many are the sinners in these days, and lights unnumbered are needed for all that are in darkness. He passed on, and saw they were also correcting another book. And when he asked its title, they told him it was called The Second Part of the Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, by one of Tordesillas. I have heard of this book already, said Don Quixote, and verily and on my conscience I thought it had been by this time burned to ashes as a meddlesome intruder, but its martyrers will come to it as it does to every pig, for fictions have the more merit and charm about them, the more nearly they approach the truth or what looks like it. And true stories, the truer they are, the better they are. And so saying, he walked out of the printing office with a certain amount of displeasure in his looks. The same day Don Antonio arranged to take him to see the galleys that lay at the beach, whereat Sancho was in high delight, as he had never seen any all his life. Don Antonio sent word to the commandant of the galleys that he intended to bring his guest, the famous Don Quixote of La Mancha, of whom the commandant and all the citizens had already heard, that afternoon to see them, and what happened on board of them will be told in the next chapter.
好，呢一節咧有豐富嘅內容。首先就介紹咗 Roque 城外嘅朋友叫做 Antonio Moreno 呢個堡主啦，好中意招待客人，思想咧就有開放，所以咧好歡迎 Don Quixote。當然啦，佢臨終都係作弄緊 Don Quixote 嘅，不過唔緊要啦。咁佢都係非常寬大、非常盛情咁樣招待 Don Quixote。佢喺屋企入面有一個奇珍異寶喎。有一個用晶石打磨嘅一個頭嘅石像，就擺咗喺屋入面房入面，一定要屋主邀請點名先至可以入去睇呢個頭。咁呢個頭有啲咩法力？就話呢個頭受過魔法打磨而成，就係有智力可以回答發問者嘅問題，但係一個禮拜只可以做一次嘅啫。咁於是乎有一次就邀請咗眾民入去，包括 Sancho 同埋 Don Quixote。各人都各自問咗一啲大家都好想知嘅嘢，譬如啲女士會問我點樣可以變靚啊 ，Don Quixote 又問我個 Dulcinea de Pasamonte 會唔會變翻靚，或者 Sancho 會話我應唔應該繼續做管治者，定係翻屋企啊？呢個頭顱都會如實回答，而且個答案亦都係符合邏輯，唔會亂咁答嘅。當然啦，有啲人就對答案唔係好滿意，譬如 Sancho， 但係 Don Quixote 都照單全收嘅。作者時候咧，亦都會開估，即刻開估就話呢個頭當然就唔係魔法，佢就個機關嚟喺地下嗰度就收埋咗一個人，佢咧就係 Don Antonio 嘅親戚，就識得答晒呢啲問題。Don Antonio 都通咗水，話俾佢聽會邀請邊個入去，所以佢大概估到應該點樣答。呢個都係小插曲嚟嘅啫。之後咧 Don Quixote 又離開咗城堡啦，咁佢就出咗去周圍睇下巴塞隆納呢個繁華現象，睇到個人賊屋，佢就走咗入去。佢一向都好有興趣嘅，而 Sancho 都從來未去過睇過，見到啲印刷過程啦，咁佢又學咗好多嘢。其中佢又問一啲翻譯者問你翻譯嗰本係咩書啊？咁佢會答佢呢本係咩咩書，就由意大利文翻譯到西班牙文。咁Don Quixote就非常欣賞佢哋，就話你哋做咗咁多功夫，但係竟然會哋嘅名落去啊，實在係太可惜。你哋豐功偉績應該受到歌頌啊！Don Quixote有問到，你又翻譯緊本咩書啊？佢就呢本書咪就係 Don Quixote of La Mancha 嘅 Part 2咯。Don Quixote 就非常之嬲啦，因為佢知道呢啲書都係杜撰出嚟嘅，同現實不符嘅，所以 Don Quixote 就拋低一句：呢啲咁樣嘅所謂小說咧，其實越係接近現實先至係越可貴嘅，你越係杜撰出嚟嘅就越係不值一文。於是乎咧，佢就唔係好高興咁，面黑黑咁啊離開咗印刷廠。我哋睇下呢一節有啲咩字用打分。Comparison 名詞嚟嘅 ，CAPARISO ornament covering spread over a horse saddle or harness 一啲馬背上面嘅裝飾。Indefatigable INDEFATIGABLE 形容詞，形容咩咧 ？Of a person on their efforts persisting tirelessly 不屈不撓嘅。文中就有提到堡主Don Antonio 嘅太太就為咗Don Quixote舉辦舞會啦，咁邀請咗佢自己嘅朋友， 啲女士們、貴婦們，咁佢見到 Don Quixote 都愛不釋手，就好不屈不撓地 indefatigable 去邀請 Don Quixote 同佢跳舞，而 Don Quixote 都只能夠就範，本來都係唔想噶啦，咁當然啦，佢係唔識跳舞。Intemperance, I-N-T-E-M-P-E-R-A-N-C-E 名詞 lack of moderation or restraint 冇節制嘅。好，我哋呢一節咧讀到嚟呢度，我哋下一節再解讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第63節，呢一節嘅名叫做 Of the mishap that befell Sancho Panza through the visit to the galleys and the strange adventure of the fair Morisca。 咁上一回咧就發生咗好多事啊，唔單止喺 Don Antonio 屋企 Don Quixote 同 Sancho 見到好多嘢，遇到好多人，見識到一個識講嘢嘅頭腦，仲有咧佢哋去咗印刷廠觀摩點樣印書啊，咁順便又俾作者打破第4部牆，表達咗 Don Quixote 對於啲不實報導佢嘅不滿。最後就會提到 Don Antonio 會帶佢哋去船上面、去碼頭同埋船上面觀摩。咁呢一節咧，我哋就睇下 Sancho 會發生啲咩滑稽嘅事。
Profound were Don Quixote's reflections on the reply of the enchanted head, not one of them, however, hitting on the secret of the trick, but all concentrated on the promise, which he regarded as a certainty, of Dulcinea's disenchantment. This he turned over in his mind again and again with great satisfaction, fully persuaded that he would shortly see its fulfillment. And as for Sancho, though, as has been said, he hated being a governor, still he had a longing to be giving orders and finding himself obeyed once more. This is the misfortune that being in authority, even in jest, brings with it. To resume, that afternoon their host, Don Antonio Moreno, and his 2 friends, with Don Quixote and Sancho, went to the galleys. The commandant had been already made aware of his good fortune in seeing 2 such famous persons as Don Quixote and Sancho, and the instant it came to the shore, all the galleys struck their awnings and the clarions rang out. A skiff covered with rich carpets and cushions of crimson velvet was immediately lowered into the water, and as Don Quixote stepped on board of it, the leading galley fired her gangway gun, and the other galleys did the same. And as he mounted the starboard ladder, the whole crew saluted him by exclaiming "Hoo, hoo, hoo" 3 times. The general, for so we shall call him, a Valencian gentleman of rank, gave him his hand and embraced him, saying, "I shall mark this day with a white stone as one of the happiest I can expect to enjoy in my lifetime, since I have seen Señor Don Quixote of La Mancha, pattern an image wherein we see contained and condensed all that is worthy in knight-errantry." Don Quixote, delighted beyond measure with such a lordly reception, replied to him in words no less courteous. All then proceeded to the poop, which was very handsomely decorated, and seated themselves on the bulwark benches. The boatswain passed along the gangway and piped all hands to strip, which they did in an instant. Sancho, seeing such a number of men stripped to the skin, was taken aback, and still more when he saw them spread the awning so briskly that it seemed to him as if all the devils were at work with it. But all this was cakes and fancy bread to what I am going to tell now. Sancho was seated on the captain's stage, close to the aftermost rower on the right-hand side. He, previously instructed in what he was to do, laid hold of Sancho, hoisting him up in his arms, and a whole crew who were standing ready, beginning on the right, proceeded to pass him on, whirling him along from hand to hand and from bench to bench with such rapidity that it took the sight out of poor Sancho's eyes, and he made quite sure that the devils themselves were flying away with him, nor did they leave off with him until they had sent him back along the left side and deposited him on the poop. And the poor fellow was left bruised and breathless and all in a sweat, and unable to comprehend what it was that had happened to him. Don Quixote, when he saw Sancho's flight without wings, asked the general if this was a usual ceremony with those who came on board the galleys for the first time. For, if so, as he had no intention of adopting them as a profession, he had no mind to perform such feats of agility, and if anyone offered to lay hold of him to whirl him about, he vowed to God he would kick his soul out. And as he said this, he stood up and clapped his hand upon his sword. At this instant they struck the awning and lowered the yard with a prodigious rattle. Sancho thought heaven was coming off its hinges and going to fall on his head, and full of terror he ducked it and buried it between his knees. Nor were Don Quixote's knees altogether under control, for he too shook a little, squeezed his shoulders together, and lost colour. The crew then hoisted the yard with the same rapidity and clatter as when they lowered it, all the while keeping silence as though they had neither voice nor breath. The boatswain gave the signal to weigh anchor, and leaping upon the middle of the gangway began to lay on the shoulders of the crew with his courbash or whip, and to haul out gradually to sea. When Sancho saw so many red feet moving all together, he said to himself, "It's these that are the real chanted things, and not the ones my master talks of. What can those wretches have done to be so whipped? And how does that one man who goes along there whistling dare to whip so many? I declare this is hell, or at least purgatory." Don Quixote, observing how attentively Sancho regarded what was going on, said to him, "Ah, Sancho, my friend, how quickly and cheaply might you finish off the disenchantment of Dulcinea, if you would strip to the waist and take your place among those gentlemen. Amid the pain and sufferings of so many, you would not feel your own much. And moreover, perhaps the sage Merlin would allow each of these lashes, being laid on with a good hand, to count for 10 of those which you must give yourself at last." The general was about to ask what these lashes were, and what was Dulcinea's disenchantment, when a sailor exclaimed, "Montjuic signals that there is an oared vessel off the coast to the west." On hearing this, the general sprang upon the gangway, crying, "Now then, my sons, don't let her give us the slip. It must be some Algerine corsair brigantine that the watchtower signals to us." The 3 others immediately came alongside the chief galley to receive their orders. The general ordered 2 to put out to sea, while he with the other kept in shore, so that in this way the vessel could not escape them. The crews plied the oars, driving the galley so furiously that they seemed to fly. The 2 that had put out to sea, after a couple of miles, sighted a vessel which, so far as they could make out, they judged to be one of the 14 or 15 banks, and so she proved. As soon as the vessel discovered the galleys, she went about with the object and in the hope of making her escape by her speed, but the attempt failed, for the chief galley was one of the fastest vessels afloat, and overhauled her so rapidly that they on board the brigantine saw clearly there was no possibility of escaping, and the race, therefore, would have had them drop their oars and give themselves up, so as not to provoke the captain in command of our galleys to anger. But chance, directing things otherwise, so ordered it that just as the chief galley came close enough for those on board the vessel to hear the shouts from her calling on them to surrender, 2 Toraquis, that is to say 2 Turks, both drunken, that with a dozen more were on board the brigantine, discharged their muskets, killing 2 of the soldiers that lined the sides of our vessel. Seeing this, the general swore he would not leave one of those he found on board the vessel alive, but as he bore down furiously upon her, she slipped away from him underneath the oars. The galley shot a good way ahead. Those on board the vessel saw the case was desperate, and while the galley was coming about, they made sail, and by sailing and rowing once more tried to sheer off. But their activity did not do them as much good as their rashness did them harm. For the galley coming up with them in a little more than half a mile threw her oars over them and took the whole of them alive. The other 2 galleys now joined company, and all 4 returned with the prize to the beach, where a vast multitude stood waiting for them, eager to see what they brought back. The general anchored close in, and perceived that the viceroy of the city was on the shore. He ordered the skiff to push off to fetch him, and the yard to be lowered for the purpose of hanging forthwith the rays and the rest of the men taken on board the vessel, about 36 in number, all smart fellows, and most of them Turkish musketeers. He asked which was the race of the brigantine, and was answered in Spanish by one of the prisoners, "This young man, senor, that you see here is our race." And he pointed to one of the handsomest and most gallant-looking youths that could be imagined. He did not seem to be 20 years of age. "Tell me, dog," said the general, "what led thee to kill my soldiers, when thou sawest it was impossible for thee to escape? Is that the way to behave to chief galleys? Knowest thou not that rashness is not valor? Faint prospects of success should make men bold, but not rash." Dores was about to reply, but the general could not at that moment listen to him, as he had to hasten to receive the viceroy, who was now coming on board the galley, and with him certain of his attendants and some of the people. "You have had a good chase, Senor General," said the viceroy. "Your excellency shall soon see how good, by the game strung up to this yard," replied the general. "How so?" returned the viceroy. "Because," said the general, "against all law, reason, and usages of war, they have killed on my hands 2 of the best soldiers on board these galleys, and I have sworn to hang every man that I have taken. But above all, this youth, who is the race of the brigantine," and he pointed to him as he stood with his hands already bound and the rope around his neck, ready for death. The viceroy looked at him, and seeing him so well-favored, so graceful, and so submissive, he felt a desire to spare his life. The comeliness of the youth furnishing him at once with a letter of recommendation, he therefore questioned him, saying, "Tell me, race, art thou Turk, Moor, or renegade?" To which the youth replied, also in Spanish, "I am neither Turk, nor Moor, nor renegade." "What art thou then?" said the viceroy. "A Christian woman," replied the youth. "A woman and a Christian, in such a dress and in such circumstances. It is more marvelous than credible," said the viceroy. "Suspend the execution of the sentence," said the youth. "Your vengeance will not lose much by waiting while I tell you the story of my life." What heart could be so hard as not to be softened by these words, at any rate so far as to listen to what the unhappy youth had to say? The general bade him say what he pleased, but not to expect pardon for his flagrant offense. With this permission, the youth began in these words: "Born of Morisco parents, I am of that nation, more unhappy than wise, upon which of late a sea of woes has poured down. In the course of our misfortune I was carried to Barbary by 2 uncles of mine, for it was in vain that I declared I was a Christian, as in fact I am, and not a mere pretended one, or outwardly, but a true Catholic Christian. It availed me nothing with those charged with our sad expatriation to protest this, nor would my uncles believe it. On the contrary, they treated it as an untruth and a subterfuge set up to enable me to remain behind in the land of my birth, and so, more by force than of my own will, they took me with them. I had a Christian mother, and a father who was a man of sound sense and a Christian too. I imbibed the Catholic faith with my mother's milk. I was well brought up, and neither in word nor in deed did I think, show any sign of being a Morisco. To accompany these virtues, for such I hold them, my beauty, if I possess any, grew with my growth. And great as was the seclusion in which I lived, it was not so great but that a young gentleman, Don Gaspar Gregorio by name, eldest son of a gentleman who is lord of a village near ours, contrived to find opportunities of seeing me. How he saw me, how we met, how his heart was lost to me, and mine not kept from him, would take too long to tell, especially at a moment when I am in dread of the cruel cord that threatens me interposing between tongue and throat. I will only say, therefore, that Don Gregorio chose to accompany me in our banishment. He joined company with the Moriscos who were going forth from other villages, for he knew their language very well, and on the voyage he struck up a friendship with my 2 uncles who were carrying me with them. For my father, like a wise and far-sighted man, as soon as he heard the first edict for our expulsion, quitted the village and departed in quest of some refuge for us abroad. He left hidden and buried, at a spot of which I alone have knowledge, a large quantity of pearls and precious stones of great value, together with a sum of money in gold cruzados and doubloons. He charged me on no account to touch the treasure, if by any chance they expelled us before his return. I obeyed him, and with my uncles, as I have said, and others of our kindred and neighbors, passed over to Barbary, and the place where we took up our abode was Algiers, much the same as if we had taken it up in hell itself. The king heard of my beauty, and report told him of my wealth, which was in some degree fortunate for me. He summoned me before him, and asked me what part of Spain I came from, and what money and jewels I had. I mentioned the place, and told him the jewels and money were buried there, but that they might easily be recovered if I myself went back for them. All this I told him, in dread lest my beauty and not his own covetousness should influence him. While he was engaged in conversation with me, they brought him word that in company with me was one of the handsomest and most graceful youths that could be imagined. I knew at once that they were speaking of Don Gaspar Gregorio, whose comeliness surpasses the most highly vaunted beauty. I was troubled when I thought of the danger he was in, for among those barbarous Turks a fair youth is more esteemed than a woman, be she ever so beautiful. The king immediately ordered him to be brought before him that he might see him, and asked me if what they said about the youth was true. I then, almost as if inspired by heaven, told him it was, but that I would have him to know it was not a man, but a woman like myself, and I entreated him to allow me to go and dress her in the attire proper to her, so that her beauty might be seen to perfection, and that she might present herself before him with less embarrassment. He bade me go by all means, and said that the next day we should discuss the plan to be adopted for my return to Spain to carry away the hidden treasure. I saw Don Gaspar. I told him the danger he was in if he let it be seen he was a man. I dressed him as a Moorish woman, and that same afternoon I brought him before the king, who was charmed when he saw him, and resolved to keep the damsel and make a present of her to the Grand Signer. And to avoid the risk she might run among the women of his seraglio, and distrustful of himself, he commanded her to be placed in the house of some Moorish ladies of rank who would protect and attend to her, and thither he was taken at once. What we both suffered may be left to the imagination of those who are separated if they love one another dearly. The king then arranged that I should return to Spain in this brigantine, and that 2 Turks, those who killed your soldiers, should accompany me. There also came with me the Spanish renegade, and here she pointed to him who had first spoken, whom I know to be secretly a Christian, and to be more desirous of being left in Spain than of returning to Barbary. The rest of the crew of the brigantine are Moors and Turks, who merely serve as rowers. The 2 Turks, greedy and insolent, instead of obeying the orders we had to land me and this renegade in Christian dress on the first Spanish ground we came to, chose to run along the coast and make some prize if they could, fearing that if they put us ashore first, we might, in case of some accident befalling us, make it known that the brigantine was at sea, and thus, if there happened to be any galleys on the coast, they might be taken. We sighted this shore last night, and knowing nothing of these galleys, we were discovered, and the result was what you have seen. To sum up, there is Don Gregorio in woman's dress, among women, in imminent danger of his life, and here am I, with hands bound, in expectation, or rather in dread, of losing my life, of which I am already weary. Here, sirs, ends my sad story, as true as it is unhappy. All I ask of you is to allow me to die like a Christian, for, as I have already said, I am not to be charged with the offense of which those of my nation are guilty. And she stood silent, her eyes filled with moving tears, accompanied by plenty from the bystanders. The viceroy, touched with compassion, went up to her without speaking and untied the cord that bound the hands of the Moorish girl. But all the while the Morisco Christian was telling her strange story, an elderly pilgrim, who had come on board of the galley at the same time as the viceroy, kept his eyes fixed upon her, and the instant she ceased speaking, he threw himself at her feet, and embracing them, said in a voice broken by sobs and sighs, "O Ana Félix, my unhappy daughter, I am thy father Quixote, come back to look for thee, unable to live without thee, my soul that thou art." At these words of his, Sancho opened his eyes and raised his head, which he had been holding down, brooding over his unlucky excursion. And looking at the pilgrim, he recognized in him that same Ricote he met the day he quitted his government, and felt satisfied that this was his daughter. She, being now unbound, embraced her father, mingling her tears with his, while he, addressing the general and the viceroy, said, "This, sirs, is my daughter, more unhappy in her adventures than in her name. She is Ana Félix, surnamed Ricote, celebrated as much for her own beauty as for my wealth. I quitted my native land in search of some shelter or refuge for us abroad, and having found one in Germany, I returned in this pilgrim's dress, in the company of some other German pilgrims, to seek my daughter and take up a large quantity of treasure I had left buried. My daughter I did not find. The treasure I found and have with me. And now in this strange roundabout way you have seen, I find the treasure that more than all makes me rich, my beloved daughter. If our innocence and her tears and mine can with strict justice open the door to clemency extended to us. For we never had any intention of injuring you, nor do we sympathize with the aims of our people, who have been justly banished." "I know Ricote well," said Sancho at this, "and I know too that what he says about Ana Félix being his daughter is true. But as to those other particulars about going and coming and having good or bad intentions, I say nothing." While all present stood amazed at this strange occurrence, the general said, "At any rate, your tears will not allow me to keep my oath. Live, fair Ana Félix, all the years that heaven has allotted you. But these rash, insolent fellows must pay the penalty of the crime they have committed." And with that he gave orders to have the 2 Turks who had killed his 2 soldiers hanged at once at the yard arm. The viceroy, however, begged him earnestly not to hang them, as their behavior savored rather of madness than of bravado. The general yielded to the viceroy's request, for revenge is not easily taken in cold blood. They then tried to devise some scheme for rescuing Don Gaspar Gregorio from the danger in which he had been left. Ricote offered for that object more than 2,000 ducats that he had in pearls and gems. They proposed several plans, but none so good as that suggested by the renegade already mentioned, who offered to return to Algiers in a small vessel of about 6 spans, manned by Christian rowers, as he knew where, how, and when he could and should land, nor was he ignorant of the house in which Don Gaspar was staying. The general and the viceroy had some hesitation about placing confidence in the renegade and entrusting him with the Christians who were to row, but Ana Félix said she could answer for him, and her father offered to go and pay the ransom of the Christians if by any chance they should not be forthcoming. This then being agreed upon, the viceroy landed, and Don Antonio Moreno took the fair Morisco and her father home with him, the viceroy charging him to give them the best reception and welcome in his power, while on his own part he offered all that house contained for their entertainment. So great was the goodwill and kindliness the beauty of Ana Félix had infused into his heart.
哇！呢一節都有好多事發生。當 Quixote 同 Sancho 上咗船之後咧，受到熱烈嘅歡迎，零炮歡迎佢。冇幾耐呢隻船出海啦，喺海圖上面赫然出現咗一個海閘事件。對方隻細啲嘅船零炮擊殺咗2名水手 ，Sancho 呢一邊嘅呢2個水手。船長係震驚，將呢隻小船捉住咗，將船上所有人都綁起。當中就問：你哋邊一個咁大膽擊殺咗我嘅船員啊？你哋邊個係大頭啊？就指出咗呢一個相貌非常之好嘅一個後生仔，發覺原來呢個人係一個女子，女扮男裝，佢嘅名咧係 Ana Félix。原本咧就上岸之後咧就諗住去吊死佢嘅，但係有一個監督就嚟咗，佢咧就想聽下呢個 Ana Félix 佢講佢嘅故事。Ana Félix 就將佢嘅生平講咗出嚟，佢本身係 Moorish， 但係佢就係有天主教嘅信仰嘅。佢亦都因為咁而離開咗佢嘅故鄉，同佢一齊離開摩爾嘅呢個地方咧，就仲有一個男士，佢叫做 Don Gaspar。而呢個人佢嘅特別之處就係佢非常之美豔動人，更勝女子。而一啲咁俊美嘅男人喺摩爾呢啲地方咧係非常之危險嘅，好容易會俾人捉咗去。 就帶埋 Don Gaspar 出走。咁但係好不幸，呢個 Don Gaspar 嘅美貌咧都係俾北非嘅國家咧知道咗，然之後咧就去捉佢。咁只有 Ana 同佢嘅幾個隨從有幸逃走。之後喺海上面遇到 Don Quixote 呢艘船。呢個監督聽完呢啲故事之後，好感動，眾人都落下淚來，似乎就決定唔單止放走 Ana 赦免佢嘅罪，仲要赦免埋佢頭先擊殺嗰兩個船員嘅人嘅罪，完全釋放佢哋。呢個船長亦都覺得，都無謂再自衛身之啦，不了了之啦。Don Antonio 就決定帶住 Ana Félix 同埋佢後嚟喺船上遇到嘅爸爸啦，作為佢嘅證人、佢嘅證詞，帶翻屋企作為上賓咁招待。呢個亦都係監督所提出嚟嘅要求。好，我哋睇下呢一節有啲咩字同大家分享。Seraglio 呢個字就極罕見啦，佢本身係波斯嘅啲中東文，就俾英文咧吸收咗啦。Seraglio S-E-R-A-G-L-I-O 名詞 Women's apartment, harem in an Ottoman palace, in Turkish or Ottoman palace, especially the Sultan's courts and government offices in Constantinople。呢度嘅意思，呢個 harem 就係女性嘅閨房。文中又會提到就係好驚呢個美男子會俾中東嘅皇室咧係捉咗去，將佢擺喺 harem。呢啲 harem 其實就係供俾呢啲皇室成員享用嘅一個地方啊。Bravado B-R-A-V-A-D-O 名詞 A bold manner or a show of boldness intended to impress or intimidate， 請人表現自己一個咁樣嘅行為，一個咁樣嘅心態。Brigantine B-R-I-G-A-N-T-I-N-E 名詞 A two-masted sailing ship with a square rigged foremast and a mainmast rigged fore and aft。咁一隻屬於有兩個帆杆嘅一個小船，屬於速度型嘅一啲小船。好，我哋呢一節讀到嚟呢一度，下一節再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。